This was the deadliest week in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime, with at least 800 people killed in the span of a few short days. That includes men, women, and children, some burned to death, others buried alive, and quite a few summary executions recorded and then published online. In fact, there was a big concern that the country was on the verge of once again spiraling out of control. But fortunately, it looks like they were able to rein things back in. And today, we're going to talk about what we know around this spike in violence in Syria over the last couple days. Starting with Charles Lister, the director of the Middle East Institute's Syria program, who I consider a very reliable source on all things Syria. He says, quote, "In the lead up to Thursday night, pro-Assad gunmen had launched 46 attacks on interim government forces in 6 of Syria's 14 governorates. But what happened Thursday night was a whole nother level. 3 days later, more than 400 government forces are confirmed as dead. Almost all of those 400 government forces were locally deployed, many killed by summary execution, burned to death, and buried alive. In the first night of fighting, pro-Assad gunmen also launched attacks on rival villages, some Sunni, others Alawite. He said some villages in Latakia refused to join the pro-Assad coup, as it's being called locally, which brought attacks and some massacres. That set in motion a spiral of retaliatory violence and killing and spurred on outside fighters aligned with the government to seek revenge." I think it's worth bringing up a map to show you an idea of where we're talking about in today's video. This is Syria as shown on Live UA Map. It's a publicly available resource. This and everything else mentioned in today's video will be linked in the description below. We're actually going to come back to this in the second half of the video because the yellow and green might soon be all green based off an agreement just struck in Damascus. But the focus today, where the majority of the fighting has taken place in recent days, is in the western portion of Syria here along the coast, primarily Latakia and then Tartus a little further south. You'll notice a couple little blots of red here. This is actually the Latakia airfield where Russian forces are still operating. And then a little further south here in Tartus is the Russian naval base. So that little strip right there is still occupied by Russian forces in Syria. But again, the focus today on the western portion of the country right along the coastline. Now moving back to Charles Lister, he says, reliable information on the perpetrators is nearly impossible to get, but evidence points to civilian killings primarily by SNA-aligned units, small foreign fighter factions, and yes, pro-Assad gunmen too. So the SNA-aligned units, that's the Syrian National Army, that's the Turkish-backed group that is primarily operated in the north, fought against the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, more on them later, but the SNA has slowly crept further south after the fall of the Assad regime. Lister says there's zero evidence that Christians have been targeted by any side in Latakia, but 3 Christian civilians are confirmed as dead. Many reports of whole families or women being killed have turned out to be false, with them coming out denying their own deaths. And that's something we are going to get into more here in a moment. I've got a list of disproven claims coming out of just the last couple days in Syria. It's overwhelming how much dis and misinformation was being spread about what was already a tragic event. People were kind of exaggerating is probably the very polite way of saying it. Lister says that command and control over peripheral armed factions is limited, and when thousands of armed men outside of any faction went to Latakia to fight and kill, it was almost impossible to control them for 36 hours, which speaks to larger issues within the overall government. All right, if you don't have control over some of the armed factions that are even fighting along your side, that's a major issue, and it's one of the issues that Israel pointed to in their recent movement into southwestern Syria, saying it doesn't look like quite yet the government has full control over these groups, and this seems to suggest that that is still the case. Lister continues by saying on the pro-Assad side, most of the known leaders are former commanders from the Iranian-aligned 4th Division. Some have an infamous history of crimes, from mass executions, burning civilians, and coordinating months-long starvation sieges. He says, ironically, much of the sentiment and rhetoric on recent events in Syria is far more aggressive and vitriolic from people outside of Syria than those actually in the country. The thirst for peace, calm, and reconciliation runs deep. People want justice, but not more war. And I think that last piece is worth remembering as we go through this story. A lot of the strongest sentiments from what I've seen are coming from outside of Syria, and it does, from what I've been able to tell, the people in Syria still today, just like they did when the Assad regime fell a few months ago, they want peace. They just want to live in calm. Now, turning over, looking at the numbers here to Fadel Abdul Ghani, the executive director of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. He says the updated toll on the extrajudicial and unlawful killings from March 6th to March 10th is at least 803 individuals. He says that includes 39 children and 49 women during the period from March 6th to March 10th. They broke it out between the government-aligned forces and then what I'll call the pro-Assad forces. I understand that it gets a little bit confusing. This is what I have found to be the most reliable data set yet in terms of casualties. I should mention that the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights historically has been a little high in their estimates, and they've put out numbers recently as many as 2,500 to over 3,000. So just know that right now some of these figures are still disputed. But anyways, coming from the Syrian Network for Human Rights, they say the pro-Assad groups are responsible for killing at least 100, or there were 172 members of the security force and military forces that were killed due to direct and indirect attacks orchestrated by these non-state armed groups, and at least 211 civilians. This is going to be very hard to parse at this point for what it's worth, because what it's sounding like is a lot of these civilians got caught up in the middle of the fighting. Who knows how much was collateral damage, and collateral damage in an active fight is very hard to pin the blame. When you start talking about undisciplined factions that are not wearing a uniform per se, it becomes nearly impossible to pin the blame exactly on one person. But as of now, they're saying 211 civilians were killed by the pro-Assad forces that remain in Latakia. Now, in terms of the actual Syrian government forces and then the groups affiliated with them, they say they are responsible for no fewer than 420 civilians and disarmed militants, including 39 children, 49 women, and 27 medical personnel. They say this is as a consequence of the large-scale security and military campaign conducted by these forces in areas controlled by armed groups outside the authority of the former regime. So we're going to get into this a little bit more here in a second. In fact, I think there's a write-up here in Syria Direct by Walid al-Nafal. He wrote this on March 8th, so while the fighting was still going on, starting to wind down, but I think he does a better idea, or does a really good job of kind of parsing this and giving us an idea of what exactly played out here, which should shed some light as to the confusion of who exactly is responsible for all of this. Now, don't get me wrong. When somebody is caught on film showing that they executed, tortured, or killed a person, very clearly that group is responsible. And as it sits right now, it looks like just about everybody involved on both sides in terms of the warring factions did carry out some degree of criminality, executions, things like that. But turning back to this piece from Syria Direct from Walid al-Nafal, he writes, on the afternoon of Thursday, March 6th, armed groups attacked government security centers and checkpoints across Syria's coastal provinces. It is not yet clear whether the violence broke out following quarrels between security and services and young men from the towns of Beit Anna and Al-Dia south of Latakia, or if it was organized and planned in advance. So was it ad hoc or was it organized ahead of time? The evidence right now points to it being planned ahead of time, and we'll get into that here briefly. He says tensions quickly escalated throughout the coast as attackers seized control of city centers and some military and security headquarters. Government forces were besieged in their barracks until Damascus sent major military reinforcements to reimpose control over the area and clear it of armed groups. In Latakia City, the forces who launched Thursday's attack were, quote, former elements of the army, security services, and forces allied with the Assad regime who are present in the area. The attack was organized and studied, leading to the killing of general security forces as well as civilians. That's according to Ala Auda, which my apologies in the pronunciation here, a Latakia resident who was living in Latakia as this is playing out and ended up telling this organization exactly what he saw. And we're going to come back to more from Ala here in a second. They say as the news of the attack on Damascus forces spread, anger exploded in Syrian provinces that were historically support bases for the opposition to Assad. Protests erupted, condemning the attacks and declaring support for operations against remnants of the former regime. Factions under the Ministry of Defense mobilized convoys heading from other parts of Syria to participate in the operation on the coast. Many videos circulated on social media in recent days indicate the use of excessive force and field executions, including of civilians, during the recent confrontations. And as you can imagine, these videos went viral across social media, as they should. So there's a lot of attention right now on not just the military actions and the numbers necessarily, but the clear executions, violation of the international rule of law and killing what appear to be non-combatants on the battlefield. They say one video shows 2 members of government forces throwing missiles. These look like barrel bombs, actually. We've got the clip here. Out of a helicopter as part of a military operation on the coast. These are notoriously awful because there's no guidance on these things, just massive explosions, and they're kind of borderline homemade bombs. They're just falling out the back of a helicopter. Lots of explosive force here, and you can't do anything more than trying to hit a city block, if you will. Like, you can't really even zero this in on a specific building. That's how inaccurate they are. They cite Ayman Abdel Noor, a director of the Syrian Christians for Peace, who said, quote, "What happened on the coast was open killing. All parties used the means available to them, regardless of whether they were legitimate or illegitimate." For its part, the Damascus government has acknowledged violations that took place during the operation on the coast, arresting one military group on Saturday that, quote, "violated instructions and committed violence against civilians." That's according to an Al Jazeera report. And going back to Ala Auda here, the Latakia resident, he said, quote, "The remnants of the regime are the enemies of the Syrian people as a whole, but the authorities' responsibility is to protect civilians, not to consider them a base of support for sectarian reasons, just like the regime exterminated entire areas under the pretext that they were a base for terrorism and saboteurs." The clearing operation on the coast, he says the clearing operation on the coast were carried out in several stages. When general security entered for the first time, they were professional. Then, when other waves of forces entered, factions affiliated with the Ministry of Defense, they were harsher, with executions, assaults, and robberies. Again, I think it goes back to the whole idea of command and control. Who's organizing these groups? And as a couple of folks have mentioned already here, there was a feeling of we have to go in and avenge these guys. We have to wipe out these pro-Assad forces that held us down and oppressed us for so long. So when they saw the opportunity, and I saw some people point to the fact that they said there's still weapons scattered all across the country, and emotions run high when you're still looking for people that assisted the Assad regime in the brutal treatment of the Syrian people with a little bit of a reason to go after them and start to exact revenge. It appears that that possibility opened up, and a lot of folks did take advantage of that, to include possibly within the actual Syrian government, which is something that I hope we hear more about here in coming days. So I mentioned earlier the insane volume of mis and disinformation coming out of the last few days. For whatever reason, anytime anything happens in Syria, the volume of misleading information is just staggering. So I wanted to run through a couple examples here just to give you an idea. So because I've seen some of this stuff spread, and it's at least worth pushing back on a little bit. First one here, great example. This is Lord Bibo, a Russian guy or pro-Russian guy. So this isn't all that surprising. But he quoted the leader of Syria, al-Shara, as saying, quote, "The time of amnesty and forgiveness has ended. The stage of liberation and purification begins." It's kind of feeding into the idea that there's just like reprisal killings going on, and Syria is now going to be a place where they go around and get their vengeance and kill everyone who's wronged them in the past or is of the wrong ethnic group or whatever. That was just made up. He never said that. There's no evidence that Shara ever said that. Fortunately, it was community noted here, but that got quite a bit. 495,000 people saw that one. So that's super, and leading to a lot of the confusion about what's happening in Syria. There's a good source here that I came across, Syrian media platform, that's just rolling out side by side like all of the different things that have been made up. This is like too much to run through in a single video, but it's everything. And they showed the now versus like what this thing was actually pulled from. They say a video showing Syrian forces looting Alawite homes. This was actually Syrian authorities recovering stolen goods in Latakia. I think they do a good job of showing exactly what is what. So they're saying this barrel bomb strike on civilians was actually an Israeli airstrike in Lebanon. There's another one that was just as bad here where it was talking about like civilian. Yeah, here we go. A widely shared video allegedly from a fallen regime member's phone claimed to show summary execution of civilians. The footage actually dates back to 2013 and is showing Assad's forces in Tartus. And this list just goes on and on and on. And we mentioned already in the video how people were having to come out and say, like, I just saw a video about how I was killed, or a statement that my whole family was killed. And like, we're not even in that location right now. So again, shocking volume of information. Here we go. A video from December 2024 showing Iraqi border forces was misrepresented. It's Iraqi reinforcing the border with Syria. Just nonstop. So just be very, very careful when you're perusing any information around the last few days. There's a lot of bad data out there. Now, as all of this was kind of coming to a close, and as of this recording on March 11, 2025, it does look like the fighting has stopped on the coast in Latakia and Tartus. But there was a deal being brokered between the Syrian government under Jalani al-Shara, as he is now known, and the Syrian Democratic Forces. And this was a groundbreaker. In fact, Seth Fransman, writing for the Jerusalem Post, said, quote, "The leader of the Syrian Democratic Forces signed a deal on March 11th with Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara. It is a historic deal that is being praised across the Middle East and that has potential to transform Syria. The deal is supposed to put together a roadmap for integration that will be completed in the next 9 months." And then quoting the SDF commander, Mazloum Abdi, he says, quote, "In this sensitive period, we are working together to ensure a transitional phase that reflects our people's aspirations for justice and stability. We are committed to building a better future that guarantees the rights of all Syrians and fulfills their aspirations for peace and dignity. We consider this agreement a real opportunity to build a new Syria that embraces all of its components and ensures good neighborliness." Now, according to this article by Fransman, he says the United States was aware that this agreement was underway, and it looks like U.S. Central Command was either supportive or at least understood that its SDF partners are about to go to Damascus to do this deal. He says this will lead to questions about the future of the U.S. role with the SDF and also Operation Inherent Resolve, the anti-ISIS coalition. And, I wanted to come back to the map here to show you exactly the kind of impact of all of this. Again, we've got the yellow here is the SDF controlled area as of today. The green being controlled by the Syrian interim government. They just signed a deal to work together and to kind of fold the SDF into Syria. That's a really big deal. This yellow area up here is where the United States has forces based out of a couple different locations, further north, further south, and one a little closer here to the center, where we're conducting alongside the SDF counter-ISIS raids and airstrikes. So if SDF is no longer SDF because they're part of Syria, we might not be there anymore, or our relationship with Syria might change entirely. But wrapping up this article here, they say the talks with Damascus could also lead to positive results in Turkey. Turkey has backed the SNA and often bombs the SDF. Ankara could now change its policy, and the SNA might now also be dissolved. This would basically mean that Damascus would then control all of Syria and all of the various groups that developed during the Syrian civil war. Think about that for a second. So we've got this tragedy unfolding on the West Coast with, again, at least 800 people killed. That number very likely could rise, including a lot of women and children and unarmed combatants. A tragedy start to finish, and a lot of people that need to be held accountable for those crimes. At the same time that happens, kind of flying under the radar, this deal that essentially unites all of Syria. This was one of the major roadblocks still outstanding for al-Shara. Would he be able to bring the SDF into the fold? Because he's generally been able to align all forces in this green area. Not 100%. There's still some outliers, and there's still some Islamic State cells operating throughout portions of Syria that, as of now, it looks like al-Shara is probably helping to provide targeting data, which is why U.S. strikes have continued. But with the SDF folded in to larger Syria, you're talking about the possibility of the most unified Syria in, at least the last 12, 13 years, maybe even longer. This is a major step, and if you're rooting for peace in Syria, you're rooting for a peaceful existence for the people of Syria, I think you have to view this as a positive step. And just like we've seen with other recent events, we hold out hope that this does lead to a brighter future, and hopefully the tragic events like we just saw play out in the last couple days are a thing of the past. And that's the last uprising, violent oppression, and attacks against civilians that we see for some time. But again, all of the sources used in today's video will be linked in the description below. That's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.